Before I get started on this talk about data ethics, I want to give you a little bit more info on my background and how I came to be giving this talk today. I'm Roy. I guess that was made clear. Not sort of a cheeseburger only part-time. Let's start with what I was doing before I got into the world of data science and machine learning, so that this all fits together. By training, I'm a computational physicist. I did research which centered on simulating the interaction of radiation with humans for the purposes of cancer treatment. And I also worked on some actual experiments that were investigating the use of exotic particle beams, also for cancer treatment. After grad school, I went to work in a cancer clinic doing what's called medical physics, and I worked in radiation therapy with big, expensive radiation machines. But then I switched to data science after about a year and a half working at in the cancer clinic. I went over to the sexiest job of the 21st century, of course. This was in the early days when it was still pretty much the Wild West. Maybe you could say we're still in the early days, still the Wild West. That's a different talk. Over the past decade, I've worked at several startups that you've probably never heard of. That's fine. I've also done a lot of independent consulting, and also mostly with startups that you've never heard of. Mostly, I tend to work with very small startups when I do my consulting. And in that time, I've probably spent about half of it as a pure independent contractor and about half of that time leading teams. If you remember the pandemic, I decided to write a book during the pandemic, and that ended up being a couple books. The first book I wrote was about hiring data people based on a lot of my experience. Chris Albon is one of the people interviewed in the book, so you can put that in the plus or minus column. I'll leave it up to you. The book's called Hiring Data Scientists and Machine Learning Engineers, a Practical Guide, and it is a practical guide to hiring data scientists and machine learning engineers. I will not be taking questions. The second book I wrote is a little pocket-sized overview of the main concepts in deep learning, and it's called Zeph's Guide to Deep Learning. Theoretically, this is the first book in a series of small books about deep learning and other data science and machine learning topics. Let's see, what else? Somehow I ended up becoming co-organizer of VikiConf, which this is what we're here for. Of course, Viki forced us to change the name for some reason. I don't, and it's NormConf. I still really don't know who Norm is, but whatever. So let's get to this talk. This talk is about ethics. But before I get to the ethics stuff I'm going to talk about, first I want to talk about the stuff I'm not going to talk about, whatever that means. So there is, I would say, a whole world of data ethics topics. There's a lot of names for this stuff. There's AI ethics, ML ethics, robot ethics, but for this talk, mostly I'm just going to call everything data ethics. There are lots of different areas in data ethics. Some of them are pretty well known. If you're on social media or follow the news, you've probably heard of several of these areas, and that's what's on this map. There's a fair amount of overlap, and the boundaries are pretty fuzzy. I did not I didn't attempt to do any Venn diagrams or anything, but it is what it is. Now, these are the sexy parts of data ethics. They're the ones that get people's attention, as well as funding and resources, and usually that's for good reason. But of these, I would say there are probably three that are the main sexiest areas at the moment. Oops, I think I went too far with this. The first area I'll call social justice data ethics. Now, this area is concerned with the effects that current and emerging data and algorithmic technologies are having on society, especially with regards to how these technologies further or exacerbate issues of social justice, such as racism, sexism, gender bias, and other issues, maybe broadly social fairness. You'll often hear terms like algorithmic bias, transparency, accountability, fairness in this area. This area is also concerned with things like whether people who provided the training data, they were the source of the training data, whether they were for different kinds of models, whether they actually gave consent to do that, or whether they were fairly compensated for providing that data. This is also an area where there's a lot of attention from big tech companies, some lawmakers, and there's nonprofit organizations and universities that focus on this as well. The next area is existential AI risk ethics. Just add ethics to everything and it becomes an area. This is an area that's concerned with the potential threats posed by human or superhuman level AI. So usually when you talk about this, you talk about like the Terminator scenario, the robots rising up. And that's broadly like if humans could produce AI that could outcompete us in most ways, but is not actually aligned with human interests, will that AI decide to just wipe us all out? This is also an area with there's nonprofit organizations, think tanks, universities that are working in this and trying to understand what these risks actually are and how you might mitigate these risks. The last of the big three is probably the one that's been getting the most press in recent weeks and months. That these are the generative model ethics. So get your norm conf bingo cards ready, because this is about stable diffusion and chat GPT. I don't know if you remember stable diffusion, that's probably faded from memory at this point. These are the models that are trained on massive data sets of images and text, and they're subsequently able to produce human or near human level image and text as a result of that. And while that's very amazing, I think, if you took someone from 10 years ago and showed them this stuff, they just wouldn't believe you. But it also raises a lot of questions, and some of those questions have been brought up today in some of the talks. But is training on this data, much of which is copyrighted, even legal? Will this put artists and writers and coders out of work? What about the bias that's in that training data? Will this clog the internet with tons of spam and other crap? Who is responsible? Who is responsible for what when you use these models? Now, those are the ones I consider kind of the big three. And I guess I should say, by the way, the first two groups, they seem to really dislike each other. If Twitter feuds are to be believed, their basic argument seems to be, you over there, you're focusing on things that don't really matter. There's also several other relatively well-known areas of data ethics, which let's see, trying to get there. Okay, here we go. Lethal autonomous weapon ethics. So this is an interesting area. Lethal autonomous weapons, those are basically drones and robots that can pick a human target and injure or kill that person without another human being having to make the decision to actually pull the trigger. People working in this area are mostly focused on trying to get international treaties to ban these types of weapons in the same way that chemical and biological weapons are banned, which might sound very hard, but if you think about it, pretty much any government with their resources could make chemical or biological weapons. But for the most part, they understand the consequences of actually using those in the international stage, so they don't do that. And that's one of I'd say the main focus of lethal autonomous weapons ethics. Maybe related to that, I guess, depending on how you look at things, is self-driving vehicle ethics. This is about cars and other vehicles that can operate without a human driver. The main probably ethical questions related to that are, for example, if a self-driving car kills a human, who is actually liable or responsible? And also, when is a self-driving vehicle safe enough to allow in public without a human somewhere behind the wheel? So as you can imagine, this one's pretty tightly related to regulatory efforts. Privacy ethics. Privacy ethics is concerned with privacy. If you're building something, how much information should you realistically collect, or do you need to collect? If you're building a flashlight app for a phone, do you really need to know someone's detailed location or their demographic info? What kinds of information should actually be not disallowed from being collected at all? And obviously, this is an area where there's a lot of regulatory action and effort that's going around that. There's also this more general thing of job displacement ethics, not just with the generative models we were talking about a second ago, but and this is a discussion that's been going on since the Industrial Revolution, if not before, so at least 100+ years. Part of the question now is with the AI revolution as we know it, is this time different? Are we going to suddenly put out way more people, displace them from their jobs? Some of the common proposals related to this are things like guaranteed universal basic income, or even outlawing certain kinds of technologies. And like I said, this is arguments that have been going on for decades, if not centuries, at this point. Now, while there are a lot of areas of ethics and all over this map, these are the areas that this talk is not really about. In fact, I'm of the opinion that the data ethics world is actually much larger than this. And most of what most data people encounter is not really this, even though it's what they're most likely to hear about. Now, if we zoom out, we see that the part we were just looking at, that's the sexy part of the world of data ethics, and it's actually pretty small. On this map, all the sexy stuff is up in northern Canada and Greenland, so you can interpret that however you wish. But instead, most of the world of data ethics is the non-sexy, more mundane, everyday, ethically challenging situations. Hopefully you don't run into that every day, but every day in the sense of every day. But let me digress quickly about why I, kind of what led me to think about this in particular. Back when I was in the cancer clinic, our main focus was on safety. We were using something very, very dangerous, which is intense levels of radiation to try to do good. But if things went bad, people could die. So there's a lot of effort around safety, a lot of discussion, a lot of professional discussion, just a lot of what you're doing is towards that. Now, my next job, I fast forward a little bit, was as a full-time data scientist, was essentially delivering pizza. And well, technically I was working on the data science stuff to support pizza delivery, even though I did do some pizza delivery to understand how this all worked. Now, while that's a much nicer moral burden, instead of people potentially dying if things went wrong, cold pizza is probably about the worst you could get to. But on the other hand, I still saw scenarios where there were potential kind of ethical or whatever kind of problems you want to imagine. Now, being on social media and whatever, I see a lot of the sexy stuff that ends up in the headlines. And I do think that it's important and good that researchers are going towards a lot of those questions. But, that's not the kind of stuff I was seeing. So there was sort of this disconnect between what I was hearing about and what I was seeing, which was very different from my sort of previous career. And I think that it's not really what most data people see in their daily work. Most people are not working at the scale that's affecting millions of users. Obviously, some people are, and also most people are not advancing the cutting edge of AI where their next thing might be the key that brings about the robot apocalypse. Obviously, some people are too, I guess, if that's going to happen. Instead, most people are likely to run into more mundane issues that they don't talk about in the headlines, but that doesn't mean they're not important. So this is really the meat of the talk, a bunch of lead up to it. So we're going to look at some examples of scenarios of the non-sexy data ethics. Some of these are situations that I was in or I witnessed, but most of them are stories I've heard from professional peers, and names are omitted and details are changed, of course. So we're going to zoom in and look at a few of these in different parts of the data world. So this I'm calling the exec abuses your analysis, caveats be damned. So imagine you've been tasked with doing an analysis to find areas that the company should focus on to improve its operations. You sort through the dirty data, you do your analysis, produce a report or a dashboard showing how different parts of the company are doing. You're rightfully proud of this. You did a lot of good work, and you present this in a meeting with a bunch of executives and stuff. One of those execs hones in on the plot showing the error rate of some operational employees and immediately declares that the people on this end of the distribution are the ones that are going to get fired first. Now you realize you suddenly have several issues. This was not the premise of the analysis you did. That it wasn't supposed to be about that. But also, you know that the anomalous performance is really actually an artifact of the data and was not the focus of your analysis. You know that someone can't just take that data at face value and use it to make these decisions. So the question is, then what do you do? A lot of the scenarios are going to sound like that. Why did we split this data up again? A large international company that you have heard of, I'm sure, hires a team of consultants, also from a large international company that you've probably heard of. The department that hired these consultants didn't actually have ML experience in-house, but one of the team members thought something was a little off and asked someone they knew, a data scientist from another department, to come just take a look. The data scientists began asking questions to the consultants and about how they achieved high performance with their model. And it turned out that the great model performance was because the consultants had been knowingly testing on the training set. So, which of course we all know that's a no-no. But they were doing that because it looked good. ETAs, what if we just fudge them? Okay, so imagine you work in food delivery. Some of us have been there, and you've been tasked with investigating the quality of delivery time estimates and how the quality affects revenue. While analyzing the data, you realize that if your company were to bias the ETAs lower by just a few minutes, it could result in a tangible increase in revenue. So if you just lie a little bit, a lot more people are going to place their orders and bring your company more money. Well, what do you do in that scenario? In the real scenario, that data scientist decided to just sort of keep this to themselves. So they didn't think it would be a good thing to be known within the company. It's too tempting. And I'll just note that this was not a company I worked at, not me, even though I was in food delivery. This is what the boss wants. A Hive exec wants a dump of data with lots of personal or private customer info, and your manager asks you to get that data and email it to the exec. You know that this is sketchy if it's not, probably against some internal policy and maybe even against some regulatory stuff or legal stuff. But your manager insists, you can't make those execs unhappy. So what do you do in that situation? How do you handle it? Let's go now to big data that wasn't so big. Your team is tasked with building models to predict the outcome of certain events. This is a marquee project of your company. They've got that headline, digital transformation, AI effort, whatever it is. You simply don't have enough data to produce anything reasonable, and you can't feasibly collect more data for this specific project. Now, of course, your manager and the higher ups insist that this project needs to work, regardless of whatever your complaints are as these data people. So what do you do in this situation? Next, we get to the sudden promotion. You're asked to attend a meeting with potential customers or investors, and your manager says, when I tell them that you're the principal AI scientist, you just nod. Of course, in reality, you're more like a junior data analyst and nothing like that. But so you know that that something is not right somehow. What do you do in that situation? Choose any color as long as it's black and made by us too. So you're asked to create a model that offers unbiased recommendations for customers. Maybe those recommendations are for your company's products, or maybe they're for your competitors' products. Of course, this is a public, unbiased thing, but unofficially, you're told to adjust the bias in favor of your company's products to help the bottom line. How do you deal with a situation like this, where publicly it's supposed to be fair, but you know that it is not? Somewhat related to that is the key value proposition. You discover that the central model-based product of your startup is actually not able to do what the marketing material claims it can do. Your company is raising money based on this claim. You've actually seemed to be the only person who's really looked into this. And you know that if it's actually used in a real world scenario, that it will fail spectacularly. No one's listening to your warnings that the sky is falling. What do you do in this kind of situation? And there's a lot more. For example, you discover that the great improvement claimed by another team isn't actually an improvement at all. No one actually bothered to measure anything, but they, of course, made this big announcement, or maybe they purposely didn't release the numbers. You discover that your company or your team is using a piece of software in its core product that has an incompatible license. It's not actually open source, or it has a license that says you need to release the changes into the public. Or you just play fast and loose with user data, like GDP, CCPA. I've never even heard of that, right? Or it's just so tempting when it's much easier to ignore those kinds of regulations. So, I'm thinking about all these kind of examples and trying to think about what are the common themes in these kinds of scenarios. And there's a few that jumped out at me. So people fudging their numbers is one of the big scenarios. It's just so tempting in many scenarios, especially when there are not others around you who could reasonably tell the difference. Either they don't have the technical understanding or they don't have the time to dig into it to really be able to tell the difference between your numbers and not your numbers. More generally, this is something called lying, but it happens a lot. Then there's the situation where someone else is trying to get you to fudge the numbers. So this is probably often due to typical unethical behavior, but also when I'd say the cold, hard truth of how difficult data-related projects are often hits the people who are the stakeholders. And, they were hoping you were going to go do that data magic for them. But then when reality strikes, they're just tempted to say, okay, let's kind of fudge this. Also, often the people just want you to provide them with whatever data is going to support their already established opinion. Just kind of cherry pick the things that I already believe anyway. And more generally, this is often a case of power imbalances in the workplace. When the big boss tells you to do something, and how do you deal with that, especially when they're doing something unethical? And then finally, there's your numbers take on a life of their own. I would say, this is often about nuance. This is related to some of the stuff that Katie Bauer talked about. This is kind of the flip side of that, and some of the other stuff people have presented about clearly communicating what's going on. But I think it's a very hard one, because you want to balance presenting the detailed, technically correct information with sort of some distilled, actionable insight or info or whatever that is, and it's easy to land too far to one side. And in this case, I'd say it's usually when you land on the side where you're presenting things too simply, and or people may willingly ignore details to confirm their preconceived notions. But others will see things in the data or your numbers that are not really there, or just whatever they want to believe. So you have to consider the possible misuses or misunderstandings and think about what your obligations are in explaining things. How could this go wrong? There was some talk about that earlier. And even though people don't want to hear about all those technical details, like, what is your obligation to prevent people from running with this and doing bad stuff? Of course, this is much, much easier said than done. All right, so what do we do about all this? This isn't a TED talk, so I'm not going to offer any nice, clean answer. This is NormConf, Vicky NormConf, and but there are a few suggestions that typically come up. One is around ethics training. My impression is that there are mixed conclusions on how effective ethics training is for helping people make real-world ethical decisions or reducing incidents of like criminal or unethical behavior. And as data people, it's probably easy to imagine the difficulties in measuring how well these kind of things work. So I don't know if that's really so clear. Another one is like culture. How does culture affect things? My opinion is that for this stuff, that the culture is set probably by two main things within an organization. One is leaders modeling desired behaviors. You want your leaders to be the model of ethical stuff, and in a way that you can relate to. The second one is incentivizing desired behaviors and de-incentivizing non-desired behaviors. I'm assuming that you're desiring ethical behavior in this. How well does that actually affect things? That's also another open question, but I think this is probably an area to focus on. Regulation, of course, there are certain scenarios that are currently subject to regulatory scrutiny and probably a lot that will be soon. On the other hand, I'd say that those are mostly probably more falling on the sexy part of the map because they're things that end up in the news or whatever. And a lot of these issues probably don't fall under that. So what are my actual conclusions? I think the world of ethics is big. It's bigger than what you hear about in the news or on Twitter. If you remember Twitter, you need to be aware of the rest of the world of data ethics. A lot of it is sort of normal job ethics, you could argue, but with the additional sort of how to lie with statistics part thrown in. I think you should think about how you would deal with these types of scenarios. Often the real world is very vague and frogs are slowly getting boiled. Often don't realize that you're in an ethics situation until you're already in it and it's too late. So I think you need to ask yourself how, when you're in the situation, if you're going to look back on what you did, how would you judge yourself about that? But I think it's also particularly important for early career people that may not have encountered this stuff before, and they may not have really heard anyone talk about it. So, you senior level people, it's a good thing to bring up to those earlier people. That's it. That's the end of the talk. I want to thank all the NormConf organizers, volunteers, sponsors, and donors. You can find me on Twitter and Mastodon. I have a bunch of websites. I'm doing a promo of my new book in the Zeph's Guides booth channel. So stop by if you want a chance to win a book or some swag. And now I will stop sharing.